McRae, settle down.
From August 1990 through January 1991, coalition forces poured into Saudi Arabia to meet the threat from Saddam Hussein.
While I was in airborne school, that's when Desert Shield kicked off. And, everybody was buzzed and talking about, what all was going to happen there. And this was a really big deal because at the time it was the fourth largest army in the world. And he had all these mechanized divisions, and it was, pretty scary stuff when you think about, the prospect of having to go over there. And when you're looking at it from the Vietnam type mentality we were coming from, because the United States always tends to try to fight its oldest, or the last war that it fought. We were looking at a lot of body bags. That's the way we were thinking, because it was going to be us versus them. And we didn't really understand what his capabilities were, or what the fighting spirit of his army was, which turned out to be not much. But you don't know that until you actually lock in.
Daugherty soon found himself in country with the 82nd Airborne.
I was too damn dumb and young to really be afraid, probably like I should have been. But it was all glory, as far as I was concerned. You were a little apprehensive, just because you didn't know kind of what it was going to be like. But when you're 19, you don't think anything's going to get you. The thought that you could die never really occurs to you.
Getting off the plane at a military base in the desert was a shock to all the senses.
It's so dry, incredibly dry and hot, and the first thing you smell, every time that I've been to the Middle East, the first thing you smell is shit as soon as the door opens, because there is no sewage system whatsoever that they can ever seem to get to work over there. And it knocks you down. And it's the same thing. You feel that heat, the fuel, will overwhelm you and kind of make you want to vomit if you haven't got a pretty strong stomach. And just the overwhelming smell of human feces. And then you have to unload. You still have to function. There's a lot of gear to be unloaded, and they want you off the plane pretty quick.
Living conditions were far from being home sweet home.
We were at an area called Champion, Maine, and it was basically, it appeared to be some kind of an old maintenance facility that was for probably the British or the Saudi Arabian Army, and we were just living in like hangars and tents there until we could get our, marshal our forces together and everything.
For the female soldiers, the culture shock was more personal.
I remember you had to, cover yourself everywhere you went at first. The degradation, I think, of it all came from King Fahd, who made it clear that women don't serve in the military, so if American women go down into our cities, they have to cover themselves like our women do. And then eventually he retracted that with the statement that, well, if they're women in military, they're probably not actually real women. And so they don't have to cover themselves. And I think that was probably the degrading thing that women had to feel. And it got to the point where the slogan, there were so many things that the Saudi government and the Saudi population made pretty clear they didn't like about our culture and our ways, such to the point that the adage going around amongst the troops is that your women offend us, your God offends us, your religion offends us, now go and defend us. And that was said quite a bit.
The men of the 82nd were now facing the fourth largest army in the world, with little more than their rifles, some light artillery, and a handful of outdated tanks.
It's important to note that the 82nd, the only armor that they brought with them at the time were Sheridan tanks. We had one company, I think, of Sheridan tanks, maybe a battalion for the entire division. And the Sheridan tank is pretty good for going, it's great for going against like dismounted troops, but tank on tank fights, not so much. So, the T-72s, the biggest fear we had is that they would roll south with those T-72s and T-55s and everything else and basically just roll over top of us. And we had no real armored defenses. So the only plan we really had was we were going to blow the bridges and try to push them out into the sand and hope to get them in a melee out there and where they couldn't maneuver as well. So they had us strategically positioned on whatever the main highway that would came either out of Kuwait or south from Iraq was going to converge right there. Protect Riyadh as well.
Training for the troopers was constant and intense.
Anything you did whatever battle drills that you had. At the time I was in the artillery, and so it was all call for fire and actually gun drills and that sort of thing, react to contact type of drills. And you're up there with the enemy, or up there with the infantry rather, the enemy. Imagine that Freudian slip. You actually have to participate in their battle drills as well. So if you're up there calling for fire and the infantry gets attacked, you are an infantryman until you can start getting at a place to call for fire to support them. So you would do a lot of that. And the biggest thing is they were scared to death of this chemical capability that Saddam had. So they were having you do all this in MOP 4. Every time that we would do a training drill, they would always throw in gas. Well, now it's 120-degree heat, and you got to put on this basically a winter suit and a mask that's covered in plastic. And they even invented a new torture called MOP Level 5, which was for mustard gas, where we would put our rain suits on over top of our MOP gear, for the blistering effect to hopefully run off of you. So it was a lot of very intense battle drills under MOP 4 conditions. That's what the biggest focus was.
When the tank crews did arrive, they had plenty of work to do before their tanks were combat ready.
They started flying out in December. My company, Charlie Company, we flew out actually New Year's Eve. We got over there New Year's Day when we landed in Saudi Arabia. It was 7 days. We started getting our tanks, it was January 7th when we went to get our tanks, and we started, just maintenance, unloading the equipment, fixing stuff, making sure everything was ready to go. And then about 2 days later, we got the word that we were going to get M1A1 tanks. And so we had to trade out our A1, our M1 tanks for our M1A1 tanks, which had a bigger gun on it. And we had to transfer all our equipment over there. We had to upload those tanks with the rounds for those tanks, that tank gun, and get them ready to go.
In addition to combat operations, logistics was receiving a lot of attention.
Well, the primary goal at the time we were moving into the country and getting established, the primary objective was what they called the defense of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Our job was, we saw that Saddam had put the Iraqi forces up along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border. It looked like they were going to come at us, so what kind of plan could we come up with to thwart any kind of attack that would come into the theater? And so for the first month at least, everybody was pouring their efforts into a defensive plan. How do we get the logistics to soldiers that are fighting and retreating back, fighting and retreating back? And how do we keep those logistical lines intact with all that moving back? And we seemed to move through that successfully. After about right into October, early October, it began to change. Offensive operations against Iraq.
During the early days of Desert Shield, a powerful 18,000-man amphibious task force steamed into the North Arabian Sea to add an important element to the Allied arsenal. Less than a month after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, more than 20 amphibious ships from Norfolk, Little Creek, and San Diego had completed the 10,000-mile trip to the Gulf of Oman. Here, nearly 8,000 Marines and 10,000 sailors commenced full-scale preparations to hit the beach to eject Iraq's army from Kuwait. The task force, with Marines from the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade and the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit, included air, land, and sea assets tailor-made for coastal assault. These included Harrier attack jets and assault helicopters to provide air cover for infantry and armor that would hit the beach aboard high-speed air-cushion landing craft. The Marines landed and began to build defensive positions along the Kuwait border.
It was almost like we went to a desert, country where there's no one around, And so we eventually, everything got worked out, and we basically just set up base camp. And again, the unit I was with, we were part of what they call the headquarters battalion or whatever, and we were there with all the higher rank generals and colonels and everything like that. We were there when the previous president, George Bush, came over. He was there with us. I mean, that was what we did. We set up, put up our camouflage nets, parked our vehicles, and just began training, waiting to hear what was going to happen next. So for months, our daily routine, you get up, you eat, you go back to your vehicle, get it ready. Later in the afternoon, we would go out, do maneuvers, practice our different, wedges and different, drive maneuvers and just like that, and come back and go to bed. It was daily. It was almost like being at a regular 9-to-5 job, only of course different hours, but it really didn't sink in that we were in another country and that we were possibly going to be, going into combat. Again, we knew it, but it wasn't really, the reality didn't really sit in until actually right before the actual war started in January, I think it was, of '90s when the actual war started.
By late December, the preparations for the invasion stepped up.
It was probably late December when we started actually, they started issuing us extra sea bags. They were like, well, we were invading Kuwait on this date and this, that, and the other. Here's an extra sea bag. If you have extra gear, they tell you the life expectancy of a Marine in a combat is 7 seconds, stuff like that. They were telling us, for those of you married personnel, if you're cheating on your wives and girlfriends, put your stuff in this bag, so it doesn't get sent home, or you might want to bury it so your wives back home don't get, letters from your girl. And all that stuff really, really started making you think, okay, I might only have seconds, 7 seconds coming real soon. And it was just really, that's when, everybody started getting really nervous and antsy, and all you can do is just do whatever you've been trained to do your whole career. By this time I had been in the Marine Corps, I think 3-4 years at the time, something like. We know it's real. We know that's what we signed up for. We're signed up to, defend our country, do whatever is asked of us, but it still doesn't really hit, sink in until the moment of truth. And again, by that time, it was like, here we go.
Not all Marine training is the same.
There was other units that were, from like California came over to do what we do. There was other AAVs from Hawaii came over there. There was other, doing from different parts of the country, different units. And that was when it really sank in that the different states, so to speak, or different units train differently. Of course, the best thing to do is to do a night movement. It's always best to do something in the dark. Well, at Camp Lejeune, we had lots of fields and tank trails and stuff, so we did nothing but train in the dark. We got used to driving with no lights at all. You just get used to driving using the moonlight, where you're driving around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you'll be sleeping, and all of a sudden your commander will come in and is like, we're moving out in 20 minutes. So you're awakened and given 20 minutes to get up, pack your gear, get your vehicles ready, start it, and pull out. And so had been used to training in darkness. Well, of course, when it was time to actually cross the border into Kuwait itself, there was units from like California, like I said, Hawaii and other places, and we thought it was odd that someone was turning on flashlights and different things, and it's like that's how you give your position away. You can get you and your your whole unit taken out, doing stuff like that. And it was another one of the moments where you get a little pride in you, because it was like you look left and look right and look all around you, and you can see where your unit stops and the other one starts, because your unit's all in pitch black dark. We're used to driving in the dark. We're used to following the sounds and using shadows and stuff, and it really made us feel good, because you can hear people over the radios, people getting lost in confusion, as I'm sure that's be expected, but it just made us feel good to know that some of the training we had got actually is going to pay off. It's working to our advantage. That my unit was one of those that really remember what we had been taught. It wasn't like we got over to combat and just started freaking out, losing our heads, and just started running around like chickens with no heads or whatever. So it was just one of them things that, again, one of the Marine Corps pride things. It's just nice to know that all the training they did wasn't just, just to give them an excuse to yell at you. They were actually training you to do your job in an actual combat situation, which when it came down to it, it paid off. It really, really paid off for us.
For a pair of troopers of the 101st Airborne, double time meant getting to the altar.
We were married 5 days before the war began. Our captain of the 101st Airborne, Captain Smith,
Captain of the company commander, right?
Suggested to us, we had already been engaged, and he suggested to us that we go ahead and get married. So he worked it out with the chaplain at the time, and gave the orders, and the papers went through, and we waited for about a month. And then January 12th.
Well, we were told the papers went through.
Yeah, we were told the papers went through.
And,
January 12th, we went into Bahrain, and that's where we were married, at the National Evangelical Church there. We couldn't get married in Saudi Arabia because you have to be Muslim. We weren't interested in changing our religion, so
No.
we went to Bahrain, and the pastor of the church there, he didn't actually marry us. Chaplain Boone married us, actually. So
It got to the point where it was interesting, because at first you think, okay, we're over here to fight a war, so it never crossed our mind at all to get married over there, to even bring it up. And so when you have your company commander, a captain, mentioning it to you, and you find out he's been talking to the Judge Advocate General, the JAG officer over the division, and then the division chaplain over division, and everybody's like, oh yeah, we can make that happen. You know, it's just arranging for something for two troops to go get married. And it turned out there were two actually marriages in the 101st Airborne Division that occurred during that time. As Glenna had said, you had to be Muslim to be married in Saudi Arabia, so we figured, how do we work this out? Well, come to find out, Chaplain Boone, who she mentioned, his name's Samuel J.T. Boone. He's now the commandant of the chaplain school at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Every chaplain in the Department of Defense comes under him and gets trained as a chaplain now. And we've kept in touch with him regularly. But what we had to do, we had to get a Saudi official, we had a liaison, a Saudi major, a Saudi Army major is what he was, from the Saudi Arabian Army. He had to get passes for us to pass over the border from Saudi Arabia into Bahrain, and then to be allowed back into the country. He forgot to sign those. And when we went to pick it up, it didn't look good. There we were in the car getting ready to get married. We couldn't believe it. We're in the middle of this and we're going to get married today. And so here it is, January 12th, and he says, you know what, we'll just risk it. And the Saudi Arabian Army was so kind to us. When we got to the border of Bahrain, that they saw our uniforms, they saw we're Americans, they just waved us right on through. And so we were there in Bahrain, in the city of Manama, the capital city, where we still have a naval port. And we got married there in that church. David Heath was the pastor of that church. He was a Canadian national. He's literally marrying us, and his bags are off to the side packed. His wife's playing the piano because they're on recall by the Canadian embassy at a moment's notice. And so when we got married that day, and then we came back through, we had to cross a very long bridge similar to the Chesapeake Bridge. And we went through, and they just waved us through when they saw us. So we got through without having the appropriate signatures and the passes, so it all worked out well. And we came back married that night.
As the Marines took up defensive positions on land and at sea, General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, commander of U.S. Central Command, began to amass a force capable of removing the Iraqi presence from Kuwait. Thousands of ground troops poured into the Saudi desert. By the end of August, an airlift was in full swing, with a plane touching down every 22 minutes. Pilots began to talk about an aluminum bridge between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. At the same time, ships were beginning to arrive at ports up and down the Saudi coast, carrying the infantry fighting vehicles and the main battle tanks of the armor formations that would lead the charge into the desert. The principal combat vehicles in these formations included the M1A1 Abrams tank and the Bradley fighting vehicle in both its infantry and cavalry configurations.
The Bradley, what it brought to the table was an offensive capability. It carried the 25 millimeter chain gun and a tow that could be used in an offensive manner as well as in the defense. So and it could move as fast as the Abrams. So the huge improvement over the 113 and even the Abrams, the improvement of the Abrams over the previous M60 was its rate of march. They were designed and developed for offensive style of warfare.
For the tankers just arriving, the first order of the day was to pick up their new tracks and get them squared away.
We start off 105 millimeter, and that's what the M60s had too. But later, when we got over to Iraq, they upgraded us to the 120 millimeter, because Fort Riley had the A1s with the 105 millimeters on it, and it also had a rifled barrel where it was grooves in the barrel, so it would spin the round out, where the 120 millimeters were smooth bore. The round just shot straight through; it didn't spin.
Well, the first thing, you know, after we had to go through new equipment training, because there's a lot of differences in the A1 and the M1 tank, and we did all that training. All the tanks had new crew serve weapons, which were still the same crew serve we used on the 105. But once we got the tanks, we had to do gunnery, and normally in the Army, you have to qualify your tank twice a year. So in order to be qualified with the tanks, we had to shoot a gunnery, and they called it Pegasus Range. They basically built a gunnery range. Master gunners are trained to do those things. So our whole battalion went through the whole, it's 12 tables, gunnery tables, and we had to do all that. And, you know, we'd been training prior to, you know, as soon as we heard about what was going on, we started training. It was like never ending, you know, all the way up through our deployment.
The Abrams is faster and quieter. The 60 is like, it's slower, and you can hear it coming. The A1, the M1A1 or the M1 Abrams is quieter, it's faster, it's sleeker. I don't know, it's like a jet fighter compared to maybe a biplane. That's how it is. It is a big difference. You know, I like the M1A1 way better than the M60.
The newly fielded M1A1 Abrams tank included several improvements over the original M1. It carried a more powerful 120 millimeter gun, possessed better armor protection, and had better protection against nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons.
The M1 just had a 105 millimeter main gun. The M1A1 had a 120 millimeter main gun. Other than that, I really didn't see a difference in them. I mean, they looked the same, except for the bore evacuator on the gun tube was bigger on the M1A1. And also those tanks we got, I guess they were from a site out of Germany, and so a lot of those tanks, the mileage was like real low. On one of my platoon's tanks had like 90 miles on it. We were like laughing at that because this tank didn't go anywhere. But I mean, the tanks were like newer, because the ones from Fort Riley had been used in the field and gunnery, and they were pretty much driven down to the nubs. So we were happy to get better tanks.
The most significant is the NBC system and the main weapon, which was, you know, went from a 105 rifle bore cannon to a 120 millimeter smooth bore cannon, which could really reach out and touch someone. And the NBC system was also very important because, you know, they had the capabilities of chemical warfare, and the M1 tank basically had like a filter system, just a onboard filter system, whereas the NBC system took ambient air and heated it up and then cooled it back down to where you would have cool air coming into the vehicle that would be filtered through two huge air filters.
Optics the same. The only difference really is the main gun, and the breech on the inside. The breech on the M1 is rounded. The breech on the M1A1 is a block, is square. But really, there's really no difference in it. It's just the main gun is really the big difference that we had. And then the blowout panels on the M1A1, there's 2 on top of the turret, whereas on just the basic M1, there's 3 on top of the turret. Other than that, it's really no big difference.
These new tanks were also safer for the crews in case of a fire.
It has well, of course, it has a blowout panels on the top back of the turret. So if your ammo is hit, or your turret's hit anywhere, and the ammo blows off, the blowout panels will blow off, and explosions will be vented up and away from the crew. It has, of course, the special armor on the front of the turret, and also in the front skirts, right over the sides of where the front fuel cells are. There's the skirts have special armor in it that are supposed to prevent penetration. It's a pretty good tank, good solid tank.
Marine Corps tank units entered combat with the M60A3. These vehicles provided the heavy metal necessary to stop the armored might of Saddam's army, which included large numbers of Russian-built T-72s and BMPs.
You know, T-72 was the best tank that they had. Most of their forces were equipped with T-55s or, you know, some T-62s. So their equipment was at best early Cold War equipment. So I knew their range of their weapon systems was far less than the Abrams. So I knew that in a firefight that I had the range overmatch. Also, their T-72, the best tank they had, utilized an autoloader. And from the basic course and the Scout Platooners course, we knew that the autoloader took several seconds longer to reload than the manned Abrams. So, you know, 2.5 seconds to reload a round on an Abrams would be considered slow. And I knew that I could probably get 3 rounds off before T-72 could re-engage.
Schwarzkopf now believed he had the upper hand. By early October, he told Powell the window of vulnerability had closed. The speed bump had become a wall.
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
In the early stages of planning, General Schwarzkopf had been offered the assistance of 5 recent graduates of the School for Advanced Military Studies, the finest war college in the world. Schwarzkopf dubbed them the Jedi Knights and assigned them the task of planning the ground assault against Iraq. The Iraqi position presented some very promising possibilities. Saddam's infantry divisions had dug in along a 175-mile line from the Persian Gulf along the Kuwait-Saudi border 40 miles into Iraq. Hussein had also deployed additional troops along the Kuwaiti coast, protecting against an amphibious assault by the much-feared Marines already rehearsing for a landing. Supporting the frontline units were armored infantry and mechanized infantry reserves. The Republican Guard, which had led the push into Kuwait, had been pulled back into southern Iraq, ready to plug any breach in the line. The Jedi Knights knew that by orienting his entire force to the southeast, Saddam had left his right flank open to attack. A swift drive to the north, followed by a sharp eastward turn, would cut Iraq's army off so that the coalition could kill it. Schwarzkopf called the proposing flanking maneuver the Hail Mary. But the plan was nearly compromised before the troops on the ground could be put into motion.
We had actually tipped our hands, especially on one particular occasion. We had mounted 2,000 aircraft. The flash briefing came down. that they were going to mount 2,000 aircraft, basically everything they can get up in the air at one time, and fly it so much toward Iraq in such a high speed it looked like we were actually going to start a bombing run into Iraq itself.
The Great Air Armada never entered Iraqi airspace.
And then they would stop just short of the Saudi-Iraqi and Kuwaiti border, all along that Saudi border there, and they would stop and then divert away back south. But if Saddam had really looked at that situation for what it was, he would have recognized if we're able to put that many aircraft in the air, we were ready then.
Even at that early date, the coalition air power was enormous.
And that was in the time frame of October that operation had occurred. And it was incredible. I'd never seen such a display of flying power in all my life. I mean, you would look up and you would just see everything. The black specks of the B-52, they're so high up, and you see the lower flying aircraft, the F-14s, the F-18s. And as you're looking up, suddenly you're just out of relapse or out of reaction. You're ducking because A-10s just flew over your head because they keep up with the sand dunes.
General Schwarzkopf placed a high priority on deception operations. These were intended to convince Iraq that the main attack would be directly into Kuwait, supported by an amphibious assault. It became very apparent to us early on that the Iraqis were quite concerned about an amphibious operation across the shores to liberate Kuwait. Schwarzkopf said, "We wanted the Iraqis to continue to believe that." So Operation Imminent Thunder was born. The Pentagon had flown television crews into the Persian Gulf to watch thousands of Marines bobbing through the water, practicing a landing on Kuwait's shore. None of them knew that they were part of a deception. Neither did the networks. Starved for footage, they broadcast and rebroadcast the images. All components contributed to the deception operation. Aggressive ground force patrolling, artillery raids, amphibious feints and ship movements and air operations. They were all part of the coalition's orchestrated deception operation. Throughout the days before operations began, ground force units engaged in reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance operations with Iraqi forces to deny the Iraqis information about actual coalition intentions. For 30 days before the ground offensive, the 1st Cavalry Division conducted aggressive feints, demonstrations, and artillery raids in the direction of the Iraqi defenses near the Wadi al-Batin. These activities reinforced the deception that the main attack would be launched directly north into western Kuwait. It also held 5 infantry divisions and an armored division in place well away from the actual 7th Corps zone of attack. 1st MEF also implemented a detailed deception operation. A series of combined arms raids, similar to those conducted in January, drew Iraqi fire, while PSYOP loudspeakers broadcast across the border. For 10 days, to the east, a group consisting of infantry, armor, reconnaissance, engineers, Seabees, and Army PSYOPs created the impression of a much larger force, engaging enemy elements in the Al-Wafra area, conducting deceptive communications, and building dummy positions. In order for the Hail Mary to work, Central Command needed to maintain the illusion of an amphibious landing and prevent the realignment of Iraqi forces to the west. Therefore, Marines off the Kuwaiti coast went through regular exercises to make it appear that they were preparing for an amphibious attack. The Amphibious Task Force, ATF, assigned the mission of deceiving the Iraqis into expecting an assault against Kuwait and conducting that assault, should it become necessary, began posturing in the Gulf in mid-January.
At that same time, the Marine Expeditionary Force were mounting false amphibious assaults. They would try to charge toward the one island. There was an island just off of Kuwait City in the Persian Gulf that Saddam had also secured. The MEF would mount up and do practice runs on that island, and they would just stop short of the island, turn around, and come back to their base.
A well-publicized amphibious rehearsal in Oman once again attracted media attention at the end of January. The media, believing a bloody frontal assault inevitable, dutifully covered the preparations and broadcast the report that was picked up by the Iraqis. The Iraqis got the message. They stationed 6 full divisions out on Kuwait's coastline, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The diluted divisions were also pinned down by Pentagon propaganda. U.S. military spokespeople told Saudi and Kuwaiti news agencies that Air Force planes were landing in Kuwait to shore up the amphibious assault. They told the British Broadcasting Corporation that the Marines had landed on Felaka Island, 20 miles off Kuwait City. The false report shot around the world and landed in Baghdad, a textbook case of disinformation. Looking back on Imminent Thunder, an Army colonel practiced in the art of deception laughed and told a reporter, "You guys did a great job." As the ground offensive approached, the ATF moved into the northern Gulf, conspicuously preparing for a possible assault. Marines from the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit conducted a raid on tiny al-Maradim Island off the Kuwait coast. A diversionary landing was not the only distraction that caught the attention of the Iraqi army.
And so there was a lot of fear tactics that we were using at that point. Using a lot of putting up, taking damaged fuel lines, damaged helicopters, damaged fueling trucks, things that we cannot use, setting them out in the middle of nowhere and just piling it up, making it look like it's operational to Iraqi intelligence, and they would in turn divert whole divisions of troops over because we had them thinking we were going to do something there. And what it did, it ended up effectively in many ways dividing up the Iraqi army before we even started fighting them.
Throughout Desert Shield and Desert Storm, the CIA and Army intelligence units sowed subversive messages in Iraq. They reaped some benefits and some bitter fruit. The Army's psychological warfare against Iraqi soldiers met with success. As the conscripts cowered in their shallow trenches, they were bombarded by leaflets. In the last days of the ground war, they were kept awake by loudspeakers, blasting from helicopters, suggesting they surrender or die. Tens of thousands who survived 6 weeks of devastation gladly gave themselves up, some even to reporters armed only with pens. 2 other sets of broadcasts went out over a CIA-funded radio station in Saudi Arabia. The first message, directed at all Iraqis, was that Saddam Hussein was an insane tyrant. It aimed to provoke a popular uprising. It failed. Hussein held his power. The second CIA radio show was directed at victims of Hussein's repression, Kurdish revolutionaries and Shiite religious leaders. They urged the dissidents to overthrow his regime. They tried with grievous results. The Kurds and Shiites were slaughtered by the thousands when they rose up against Hussein after the war and fled into exile by the millions. Training grew more intense as the hours clicked away toward H-hour, the launch of the ground war.
And it was very incredible, the deceptive operations that were going on. A lot of people don't give a lot of credit to psychological operations, how powerful they really are. And we had used an awful lot of that to convince the Iraqi army that we weren't ready to go by January at the time of the UN deadline, which was January 15th. And we were ready to go, honestly, probably as far back as November. But we wanted them to think we weren't ready, and so they kept packing their stuff away because where Saddam had isolated himself, he thought the Arab region would stand behind him.
Along with massive amphibious exercises, embarked Marines responded to calls for assistance from Maritime Interception Force warships. Marines were among the first combat troops placed aboard uncooperative Iraqi tankers during maritime intercepts in the early days of Desert Shield. As G-Day, the beginning of the ground war, neared, 17,000 Marines stood ready aboard the largest combined amphibious assault force since the Incheon landing in Korea. Meanwhile, the coalition's ground forces conducted feints and reconnaissance in force along the Kuwaiti border. The 1st Cavalry Division staged ground and artillery attacks near the Wadi al-Batin, a dry riverbed that runs parallel to the Iraq-Kuwait border. And coalition forces moved to hidden locations so secret that even the tankers weren't sure where they were.
I had no idea where we went. We put the tanks on heads, and they put us on buses, and we drove for 12, 15 hours, a long time. We stayed on these buses, and then they just stopped, and we got off the buses, and our tanks were sitting there, and we got a direction, go that way and set up your assembly area. And we drove out there and set up our assembly area, and I had no clue where we were. We were just out in the middle of a flat desert. And they didn't give us any directions of where we were or any location where we were at all. We didn't even have maps.
Then, as always in the military, you waited.
We stayed in that location till probably mid-February, and that's when we made that move to the west. But we stayed there for, I say, maybe probably a month where we were at.
A day before the launch of Operation Sabre, the sailors and Marines of the Amphibious Force found that their war-fighting skills would not be immediately required as they had expected. But their preparation had not been in vain. It was at the core of the deceptive tactics which played a major role in the quick Allied victory. As the beginning of the ground war drew near, intelligence indicated that there had been no shifting of Iraqi forces. The grand deception had worked.
General Schwarzkopf had given a briefing that if the President of the United States would ask them to go at the time of the deadline, that they would be short of actually defying the order, saying they wouldn't be ready till February. We're in fact ready to go before Christmas.
The trap was set.